we had Sunday night, we accepted bottom line.
No.
I've been on the waiting list for Harbor Springs since.
Stand there making a call.
It's
It's
a-
7:40 in the morning.
But then I got.
20 years.
I
I wouldn't move anyways.
Which
And,
contractually you
I
can't.
got here
What do you fight about?
Okay.
So now we're back
So
to
that's
square one.
good.
We're doing it
The
twice.
drive time.
There's still
Four columns.
4 or 5 showings today.
there's a shuttle.
But the seller is a big grade. I really like it.
From time to time, I got out of it, just
Things
because
that you
COVID
know,
thing,
business,
you lock the doors, you can't go in.
Okay.
sales, I've done a few purchasing contracts. He's not an attorney, but he's
Not the same.
talking a lot of them, so it's
At all.
good.
Sure, he loved
I've
having.
been, work with people.
Yeah.
I don't
I
know.
think they're pretty much,
Done
well, I think we
some
can watch.
There's almost 16.
Okay.
Marketing is
Marketing.
good. Yeah.
Gone to a meeting.
And with a private firm or with a?
Technology and telecom.
Really?
Hey there.
Consulting or?
And for a little service.
Hi, I'm Emily Dubay.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
This is the drag.
I bet, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So have a seat anywhere you want, if you want to. You do anything
Like
if you want.
everybody, I'm sure.
How's your summer going?
Grab a chocolate.
It's going.
They've gotten into.
Just a couple of notes.
A lot of
Do you have a
consulting,
kid?
bringing technology.
No, he's back. No, he's back. He
So
was
he was
there.
able to go to
He
Canada.
was. We have a little bit of an advantage. He's actually a Canadian
That
citizen,
is now.
truthfully. So we got him in at the end of January. And I mean, he had to stay quarantined. He did 14 days in his aunt's basement. So,
Fun time, yeah.
but then he was there until the end of May,
Doesn't drive us without you guys there.
working.
What year is it?
He just finished his sophomore year.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, thank God for child labor. Both kids are working.
I don't think-
fully,
I don't think so.
otherwise he
You wouldn't be doing it.
wouldn't be making it. Or he would just be working all the time, like never stop. So.
Time to look at them.
I know. And if you're gonna probably have to give money anyways, you know. Yes.
So he does, he just pays them the going rate. So, no, it works out. It means I just say, you've got your own money.
Yeah. And it works.
And when Josie comes home with something, I'm like, your pennies.
Well, she didn't even go to the office yet, and she wanted to-
How's your summer going? I saw construction has started, or at least
Yeah.
dirt moving has started.
Yeah. Dug out.
And drove to the front.
All the little trivial stuff, but it's big stuff for us. Yeah.
Yes, that's fun. But hey, I have my fingers crossed, my construction company is.
How are you?
We're adding a 20-bed.
When I see that one, I sit down and go, where do you want us?
Yeah.
I would say around the way. Yeah, not from,
We do memory care now. It's a little bit of a challenge for residents who explore. And exploring isn't even the right word because they're not exploring and they're not wandering. They have a destination in mind. Most of them is they're going home, which is not here. But for people who do that, we just have so many doors and very. Instead of there's the alarms, like an alarm the doors, it's we have so many doors. Somebody goes out a hallway where
I think I told, you know, because they like, I'm not sure what
Or-
your friend is.
Okay.
How are you?
So-
That's great.
So the new building will be an ID. Yeah. So that we'll have key fobs and all that good stuff at the new building. So it will be more.
We met years ago.
Yeah.
When I met John Baker, maybe.
Yeah.
Man, I feel special.
Powerful enough to get
Wow. I do, I've got my big one, but that always makes me look like I work at the hospital. That's what I said.
Don't you feel
Yeah,
you're
we're
Like Chicago.
We're all coming out. And then all of our neighbors have been.
Is your barn going to Buster Road?
Yeah.
Cool. My parents live, well, one, two, three driveways to the west. So there, as you go up Hoyt and turn right on Buster, you go past Black Forest Farm, you ever notice that sign? And then down this dip, and just as you come up that hill, before you get to the field, they're on the right hand side, the house is burned. If you notice
Yeah,
that.
that was on the
Their,
other side.
yep, their driveway is immediately opposite. They're not the house by the road. They sold that 2 acres to a friend 25 years ago. They live about a quarter of a mile south on the driveway. They actually look out over the weekend golf course. They moved there when I was 5, 6, something like that. But then I saw the,
I wrote it down.
Leo,
I wrote it
thanks for
down.
purchase. That's cool. I'm glad he bought that.
Yeah, 40 acres.
Yeah. That's, I think the Marco family owned that for, and they, golf course number, I always thought they was like, and they should have bought my 76 when my parents bought their property. They should have bought that. Your Labrador retriever showing up at the caddy shack. That was always a call where you're like, look at the dog. You know. We had one in particular that had a nose for, oh yeah, she knew right when break time was.
I need to, no, that's okay.
We were on Main Street, our dogs would wander, but they would go over the fence across to the flower shop.
Oh, yeah.
No, across the road, that's a very busy road for them to be going across.
That's over here again.
So it's not in their jurisdiction, I guess. Well, it's in their jurisdiction. Well,
I need to win the lottery. It's the corner. I always wanted for my grandfather up on Robinson.
Oh. So Robinson and Wilderness.
Yes.
Had a cow barn. It was,
How was your day?
Good.
Oh, yeah.
They're just not doing it.
So that's not, yeah, they're not doing that. They sell them their farm.
Well, no,
Like the Goodhart farm.
the legacy, no, that's the other side. Farms, and they still own the homestead, but that's, for broad, that's,
Get it out.
It's like a wood train, or they bought Legacy Farms.
They're doing it
across the
for-
road from Sarah and Paul.
Got
But the corner, which was the old cow barn that Sarah redid to a horse barn years and years and years, I think I was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Outside, I was
Yeah.
gonna say outside, cause I just went on a con.
No, he did.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and then Jay. Sort of, yeah.
They sold that.
It's like.
I always heard it was like.
Oh, yeah. That's where the yeah.
Yeah, right. So it's been- We'll ran through that one. Right there, also on the trail on the south side. I think Jay was on. It's so hard to keep up with.
Hi. I'll be back here.
It's,
No.
That's right. Yep.
Okay, wind out there today.
I think it's because it was so hot, and then we had thunderstorms, now it's cold, so like sort of, it's kind of more like July.
Yeah. I know there's some crazy. Nobody's.
I know it's the temperature in the bay.
I was in it.
I swam
2 weeks ago,
Sunday.
yeah. For this time of year.
You know, your first time in is
Yeah,
a little. Well.
We used to have swim lessons down the raft. I remember my mom sitting in the Volkswagen dash, car running in the heat on, drinking coffee out of a thermos. I'm like, if your parents have to run the heat during swim lessons, you shouldn't be in that lake, you know.
It's nice party hard
Yeah,
here.
I was like, were the lessons in July? Why did we have to go at 8 a.m.?
Oh, yeah, the first 2
Always
weeks.
the first 2 weeks.
Oh, no, that's what Josie always did.
I wasn't gonna push them, but they were, got our girls every summer for a week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
neither of mine. William only did it one summer. Josie did 4 summers, and she
Pretty good.
enjoyed it. But now she has, because then they start pushing them to families.
I mean, the race park was. Right.
A sailing family, like, oh my God. It's all different. Yes, they were sailing together. Nephew. Do it. And he's like, but I don't know anybody. Like, how do I do this? And I'll tell you, I'm good about
Well, I think now they have their own boats to race.
He's not a kid who's good at that. It's just, I don't know any of those people. You know, I'm like, honey, here's my nephew. Can you take him on your boat? Please, that feels a little weird.
Do they do, now they do it, race series, right? They race their own 420s. Like these. We have.
Okay.
They were great because they were strong. They were also all waterlogged. Oh, that's all. It's like the mount capsized. They used to sew big foam panels on the.
It's an interesting
sail so they wouldn't turtle. They put a new kid in a boat with you.
So we were getting a discussion, I didn't even brought it up, but whether people. They don't wanna raise.
Yes, thank you. And that's the thing.
So we don't mind.
Yeah.
Military, did you run?
He was
No, that helps. Yeah.
We've been doing the same.
It's all good. It's all
I did not.
No, we were at that.
And
He saw it too.
And I wanted to speak it.
I was.
I'm just about, when the heirs come and say,
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a handout.
actually cutting over.
Not that that's all.
Nice.
Well, at least-
Things that might have to.
But you guys know Carolyn?
No, but then you're, yes, you can, and you take it off.
Yeah. Mike, did you get one? Yep. Okay, good. We're gonna wait just a couple minutes. Pick up a couple more people.
Are we waiting a few more minutes?
Yeah, just a few more minutes.
Can I ask you a totally
Oh, me? Yes. Yes. It is what is considered a warming kitchen.
Oh, sit and listen.
And we're gonna. No, we'll be Good.
They were good. They were here.
Second week
Part
of,
the information
first week of
really
July.
But because of some of the lines, some of the answers we got. Yes, for this, but no for that. So we're just trying to see what reaction. She signed up for the They're Yes, please do. See you.
Good, ain't it? There's some on the
To make it a funny little.
I know, Let's answer one here. Yeah, okay.
All right, well, why don't we get started, everybody? First of all, welcome. Glad you're here. Thanks for coming on tonight to talk about a really important topic. And this is going to be different than our regular city meeting. So we're not under Robert's Rules of Orders. We're not swearing people in, not doing that stuff. It's more about having a conversation than, making decisions. We don't even need to make any decisions tonight. All we need to do is just talk about things. And so that's why I'm so glad that you're here. We're looking for really good, thoughtful input as the Planning Commission is thinking through some tough and complicated issues. So that's why we're here. Victor, can you go forward one? So here's the outline for the meeting, and these are just suggested times. I'll tell you a little bit about this meeting just for the first few minutes. Then we'll give you an introduction about some things related to the Planning Commission and what we're doing here. And then we'll tell you a little bit about housing, just as a level set for everybody, give you some facts and figures and just some basic background so that we can all talk more productively. And then we've just got some questions for your input. And the 4 questions that you've got on the handout right there are the ones that the Planning Commission really needs your help on. And then we'll wrap it up, and it will be quick and fun. And there's no reason to be angry or mad tonight. We're all neighbors and friends, and we're just looking for input and ideas. So that's why it'll be different from a city meeting.
Yeah.
All right, next slide. Yep. So the purpose is to get your input on some housing strategies that the city's considering, and to help us think this stuff through. The approach that we want is to be collaborative, respectful, fast-moving, and productive, and we're targeting like 3 minutes per comment. So it's most effective if you can say things succinctly and clearly, and I can see this group here. This isn't going to be a problem. You are thoughtful and good communicators, so that will be great. So here are the 4 questions that we need your help with. And then at the end, we can talk about all kinds of things that you might want to talk about. And there's one key thing that's not on here, and that's short-term housing. So if anybody here wants to talk about short-term housing, we're going to have a separate meeting for that. It's so complicated on its own. It warrants, a good deep dive. And we didn't think we could do it here. So if anybody is disappointed and wants to leave, that's okay. No hard feelings. And we'll talk about this other stuff. And
Not you.
oh.
Nice try.
Okay, next slide, please. All right, Andrew Bowman.
That's why I wanted to leave, because I know it's my turn. My job tonight is to talk as little as possible, but Planning Commission, for any of you who aren't familiar, we're appointed. It's a 9-member committee appointed by the mayor, approved by council, and it's a 3-year term for each person. You're not necessarily reappointed, but that typically is what happens. The members right now are myself, Andrew Bowman. I'm the chair. Mary Catherine Hanna is the vice chair. Mark Boudet, who you all probably know, Jack Deegan, Al Dyka, Emily Dubé, who's also here tonight, and Bill Muller, who's here, George Pete, World's Greatest Sailor, and then Beth Rowley, who's also here tonight. So, right, yes. And that's the members. And our job really is typically our role is to advise city council or make recommendation to city council as to what the zoning code should be. They then adopt or send back with our recommendation. So we don't actually write the code, but we do make recommendation for the language on new ordinances when there is an amendment to the code. Most of what we do is hear site plan requests, either special land use or uses by right. Some things can be approved administratively by the city administrator. Other things require a vote or a hearing at the city council or planning commission. I won't read each one of these things that we do currently, and the reason that we're here tonight is our responsibility is every 5 years, the planning commission by state law has to review the master plan. And this year we're taking kind of a more comprehensive review. It was really good timing to do it during COVID. So these types of meetings were really difficult, but we've been able to get, I think, good input despite some of the limitations on gathering. So, and then as far as the master plan itself, it's not law. It's required by the Zoning Act of the state of Michigan. It is a component of the Zoning Act, and it is sort of the guiding principle. It's aspirational. It's not regulatory. So that's part of the reason it's important. It's supposed to be the vision of what do we want town to be 5 years, 10 years down the road. So it's a long-term plan. And then subsequent to reviews of the master plan, you look at your zoning code and try to realign those 2 documents with the assistance of more public hearings, and then obviously ultimately city council will be the one that decides what's adopted. City of Harbor Springs, people are pretty familiar with the town because you're all here. It's around 1,200 residents. That's a mystery. Also, the other mystery is everybody says town is a mile square. It's not. Nobody knows where that started, but it's close. Summer population, roughly 3,000, we think, inside the city limits. About 1,000 housing units. That would be condominiums. Anything you can spend the night in, house, condominium. About 40% of those are principal residents, that meaning designated on their tax bill as a principal residence exemption. And as far as we know, although we're not going to cover it tonight, just for reference, there's about 50 short-term rental licenses. And that is a requirement of the city that was adopted about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. Short-term rentals now need to be licensed. So that's really the summary of what the planning commission does. So that 5 minutes or less.
That was beautiful. And Mary Catherine will take us through some basics on housing in our area.
So we just kind of wanted to set the stage for everybody and give you a sense of kind of where we are. I think Andrew's comments about what Planning Commission does is a really good grounding kind of for the discussion tonight and what we want to accomplish. Because that master plan is an aspirational document and thinking ahead, one of the things that we have to know is where are we and why do we need to address certain things in our master plan? Housing North, which is an organization that kind of grew out of Networks Northwest and deals with housing regionally, did what's called a demand study about 2 years ago.
And when you break it down, these were some of the numbers that came up for Harbor Springs. And, you know, it's 80 units doesn't seem like a lot, except when you think about the fact that we only have 1,000. So 80 is a huge percentage of 1,000 in terms of additional. This is additional demand. This is, we have people who would take these units right now if they were available. So you're talking 80 units in terms of rentals and about 24, 25 in terms of ownership. Now remember, this is just inside the city limits of Harbor Springs, and that's all we can deal with as part of our master plan and as part of planning commission. When you talk regionally, the demand is exponential by factors of 10 or 50. When you look at Emmett County, the demand for rental units goes up, spikes up to about 1,800. And that is demand right now. That's not like speculative demand. So obviously this is really important to us as we think about land use in the city of Harbor Springs, what exists currently in the city of Harbor Springs, and what do we think we need in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years if we want Harbor Springs to stay viable. You know, Harbor Springs certainly looks a lot different than it did when I was a kid, and the mix of, you know, who's here and the housing is different. It was different when some of you guys were kids, and it certainly was different at the turn of the century. So if we also think about ourselves being set historically, right now is always a hard target. And kind of what we look to as a historical precedent. What do we want Harbor Springs to look like? What do we want it to feel like? What do we want it to be like? And what do we want to be when we grow up is always an ever-changing question. All right. These are some of the barriers in terms of why housing in general isn't being built. And when we talk about housing demand in the whole region, we're talking housing at every level. Okay, this isn't like just low-income housing or just middle market housing or high-income housing. This is housing at every price point. Construction costs, and this number is actually a little outdated. It's higher than that. For those of you who pay attention to that kind of thing, high cost of property. Lack of infrastructure. This isn't quite so much an issue right in the city limits, but as you get just outside of the city limits and bigger, it becomes a huge issue. Percentage of homes in the second home market. This isn't even VBROs, right? This is just people who bought a second home and come and be in it. Change in demographics. This is a huge one, and one that we really have to think about and struggle with as planning commission and as a city, thinking about who's living here right now, who's going to be here in 5 years, who's going to be here in 10 years, and how do we make sure that the housing that we have, the housing stock that we have, matches that demand. So if we're talking about houses that exist right now that have 4, 5, 6 bedrooms, and the average household size is 2, housing stock doesn't meet what the housing market wants. So that is something, again, to be thinking about in terms of what does our land use look like? What does our zoning look like? What are we allowing in certain areas? Next one. There is no single solution to any of this. I wish there was. There was a group of us that started meeting about 5 years ago to work on housing, and we were like, oh, we'll get some of us together, we'll get some smart people in a room, and we'll just get this taken care of. Well, here we are 5 years later. Because it's going to take all of these different kinds of things. Some of these things zoning can address, some of these things planning commission can address, some of these things we can't. They're outside of our control. But if we set the stage as a planning body, as a city, then some of these other things can happen layered on top of them in order to address the issue. Is there one more slide? I can't remember. Okay, let's go on to. This is kind of what I want you guys to think about. This is the type of housing I've kind of been, as I've done this presentation a fair amount around in the community. But as I think about this, my theme is back to the future. Or everything new is old again, everything old is new again. This is the kind of housing that used to exist everywhere in all of our communities. This kind of middle market housing, this kind of duplexes and quadplexes and courtyard dwellings that you would walk by on the street every day and hardly even notice that they were there. And unfortunately, for lots of different reasons, has gone out of vogue and has become an issue in current zoning. So this is the kind of thing that we kind of want to look at and think about, how do we feel about this in our community? Is this something that seems attractive to us? And I think the next slide is also.
That's the first question.
Oh, first question. So, so this is kind of what we want to think about in terms of our planning. does this seem reasonable to us? Or is there something else that seems reasonable to us in terms of thinking about next steps in our planning? There's lots of different other options, lots of different ways that you can take this kind of stuff, but I guess just kind of my personal closing point would be housing is incredibly important for economic development. It is a key piece. I mean, we've all seen it right now with the restaurants they can't hire, the businesses that are struggling, places that have had to close because they can't hire. I will tell you as an employer right now, all we're doing is cannibalizing each other. My staff have just jumped around, and I don't blame them. They'll jump for more pay. Great. That is a rational economic choice for them to make. But it makes it really hard for us to think about how do we maintain our community? How do we make sure that this community exists for us in the way that we want it to exist in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Anyone have any questions for me? Yes.
What is a live-work unit?
Live-work is mixed use. So that's like when you have downtown areas where you have businesses underneath and residential on top. Or you have places, this is more prevalent in sort of urban areas where you actually live in your place of business. So you would actually have like a studio space where then you have a little bedroom in the back or something like that where you could live.
Okay.
Yeah. And we, for a long time, we decided we frowned on that. But now people are moving back to kind of a craftsman thinking about this, right? If you've got a little business and you're making a little something, why can't you make it out of your house? That seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Any other questions? I mean, believe me, I could talk for like 6 hours on regional housing topics. So, yeah. Okay, great.
That was great, perfect. All right, now you ready for your part? Okay. Hey, can we go around real fast and just introduce everybody since this is such a collaborative, friendly kind of a meeting? Good. Caroline, you can start.
Hi, I'm Carolyn. I live on Summit.
You could also use last names if you want to.
Oh, Carolyn Candler.
Oh, let's go front row. Okay, we know you.
Dan Mulder, 7th Street.
Jen Nair, Snively Court.
Mike Bartlett, Petoskey.
Welcome.
Lisa Nickel, M119. Nancy Rondell, across the street, on Street.
Tracy Beckley, I live on Ann Street. I'm actually in the township side of the street.
Were you ready?
Randy Seiss, West Traverse Township.
Margie Marks on Arbor Street.
Beth Raleigh, Arbor Street.
Emily Dubay, and I'm on the corner of Nelson and Main.
Andrew Bowman, you already heard from West Traverse Township.
Catherine Trumbull Nielsen, I live in Harbor Springs on West Bluff Drive.
Beautiful.
Kate Bassett, I'm here with Purple Light, but I also live in West Traverse.
Yeah, you gotta stay here. That is great. Okay, are you ready? Here we go. Victor, question number 1. So this is where we can share some stories about what you're seeing, about housing in the market. If you have friends, relatives, what do you see, and what's your perception of the availability of homes in the city and in the area?
Very limited. I watched my son try to buy a house in town several years ago after bouncing around to condos and one thing, and couldn't do it. Unfortunately, something came out in the township that happened to be available, and I was bidding for with 3 other people, and he managed to purchase it. But I've been here since the 1970s and lived in several places in town, out on a farm, back in town, and then I went to Dallas for a little while. And when I came back, it's always been thus, there's no place to rent. And a lot of us would be happy to rent. So I ended up having to buy a place, which would not have been my first choice. And now, if I were to sell it, I could make a great profit, but I would have to go somewhere else to live outside of town. Then I wouldn't be able to, I'd be priced out of my home or my local town.
One of my challenges were because I had been renting for a while and bouncing around. In fact, there was a little sign my friend made. But I was looking for something small, and I owned some property. But I was looking for something small because it was me or maybe my partner, and I didn't want the mega thing. But I also wanted to be in town so I could ride my bike, go kayaking, do everything. And I finally broke down and built, but then I ran into another thing because the way the zoning was, I couldn't build quite as small as I wanted to. So I had to go a little bigger, which was okay. But I had this idea that I wanted to be a certain size or a certain, type, and it just couldn't happen. So there were a couple things but I finally built something, so I'm here.
Good. I'd like to come back to the size thing that you experienced when we get to that part. Mike, what's going on in Petoskey? Probably all easy to rent places over there and.
There's a, high demand and low supply. I should mention also, I own a rental in Pleasant View Township. And anytime, and it's long-term rental, not short-term rental. Anytime I put it on the market, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of prospects that I can be very selective. So there's great demand and low supply. And, but that's happening all over the area. I talked to Marty with the building department, and he said they anticipate having a record year for building permits in Emmet County this year. There's housing going up all over, and it's very expensive. Where I live right now, there's 3 homes under construction. And I have a kind of a question about zoning, I guess. You're not able to build homes as small as you used to 30, 40 years ago, is that correct?
Well, there came to be minimum lot sizes and minimum housing sizes, and that was something that came into the zoning code starting, I think, in the 60s and 70s, but really became prevalent in the 70s. So no, I mean, it used to be that there weren't restrictions, like nobody cared how big of a smaller house you built on your lot, but then zoning went into effect and started to address those, and so now those exist.
Kind of a suburban model almost.
Pardon?
It's kind of a suburban model,
Okay.
like a suburban sprawl model rather than.
In the bold reality of it all is that the value of the built environment will rise to whatever people want it to be. If this is, we know that Harbor Springs is a very desirable community, so people are clamoring to get in here, and they'll build as much as they can possibly afford. And I did a study years ago about the city of Detroit, how the housing in Detroit started out in the early 1900s, started out very small, and then it was replaced. Those were all replaced by bigger houses. And then downtown became built up with, commercial and that sort of thing. And then in the 50s, it started to decline and it got hollowed out. So the same thing has happened here. I've been here 10 years now, and I've been visiting here since the late 60s. And a lot of the smaller houses that were down Main Street are gone and have been replaced by bigger ones. And that's just a natural thing. People, if it's a desirable community, people bid the price up to whatever they can afford. And that leaves the less expensive availability disappears.
Anybody else have any experiences recently?
Yeah, I've had some experience talking with people in the, maybe 35 to 45 age group who want to settle here and are able to offer work here, and they can't find a place to live. Even when things do come up, they're so out of their price range that it's laughable. And they have great skills, and I know we need these people, here. We want young families, and our population in our schools are dropping. And if they don't have affordable housing, I don't know how we're going to attract them and keep them. And that's what I'm hearing a lot of.
That is one of our other key questions, so I'd like to focus on that a bit more too. Yeah, Carolyn.
This was 2 years ago, but there was a music director at Crooked Tree that was hired and moved here with his wife and 2 kids, and they could not find a rental, not because there weren't any available, but because no one would take him with the 2 kids. And then he even tried to call, you know, to see if they could get some enforcement against discrimination, and nobody even cared. He had a terrible time. He ended up living in like a 1-bedroom rental for quite some time.
Must have been fun.
I don't think so. He was a big guy.
Well, I was gonna bring up something, and Andrew, you can help me out, because I can't remember the years. But I was on the local school board, and I was president of the school board for quite a while. And, when you guys were in high school, what did you go, you
Do I have to say this publicly?
I can't hear it.
1990.
So prior to that, we had a very interesting, viable, small town in which people could come, and the building was going, but we had lots of people who could come and live here. We had all the supports, you know, we had builders and we had electricians and we had all sorts of things. And what happened was we had this blip in the elementary school of all kinds of little kids. And that's when we had to build Blackbird, because we thought the blip was gonna continue on through, which was kind of interesting, but it didn't, it sort of stopped. But it was a very, very vital town of all sorts of us, from resorters to, you know, all kinds of stuff, and it's disappeared.
I think the
And after the 80s, when everything, or when the
I think my class was 67, 65 of us made it to graduation. I was one of the 65. Then I think they got up to like 90 was the biggest class
the
ever.
class size.
And I don't know the exact, I've been told that a lot of the classes now are back in the 50s and 60s. We have a
Oh, it's
12-year-old.
really dropped. Yeah.
Her class was 48 when it started in kindergarten. They're now back up to about 55 or 60. So they're about back to where it was before the blip.
But when we hit 2008, and the
Yeah, we're all,
bottom dropped,
I think this graduating class was.
that's when all the contractors just, there was no work, and they didn't come back. And I don't know, that's about the time when I went down to Texas for a while, and I don't know exactly why they that did not come back.
There was a loss of tradespeople that's hurt us. Yeah, I've heard people talk about the hospital, you know, they offer jobs to some really skilled people with nice incomes, and they can't find a place to live. You know, teachers, you know, if you're not from around here, I don't know how we're gonna, you know, recruit you.
And we always had a thing on the school board when we were hiring superintendents, and the motto was a cut in the pay for the view of the bay.
Yeah.
You know, so there are all those things, but it's a viable town needs a mix.
Well, and I think it's tough because I think there's a misperception about what affordable is. If you look at the count, and when I say affordable, I just mean housing that somebody can afford. I mean, that's all that we mean when we talk about it. But if you look at the average income in Emmett County is about $60,000, which means based on the housing index, right, of either 2.6 times your income or no more than 30% of your income on housing, essentially you can afford a house that's $180,000 to $200,000.
Where do you?
Yeah.
That to me says it all right
Fine
there.
one.
Like if that's the average income in Emmett County.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know there are plenty of people who have more income than that, right? But we're talking the income earned in Emmett County. That to me is the story.
And then you couple in transportation, which doesn't exist in our average, and things like that.
Well, once you factor in transportation, so then you should be spending no more than 42 or 43% of your income on the combination of housing and transportation. And when you look at the statistics in Emmett County, it's about 90% of people are spending more than that already.
Right.
The new census material should be out, I guess they were saying mid-August. Is that gonna be able to help you hone in your numbers a little
It
better?
will.
Okay. I'm
Yeah, but I have a
curious.
feeling it's not gonna tell us good news.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see them.
The old data shows that Emmett County has a 6% cost of living OD on top of the state average. So it costs more to live here.
Yeah.
It's hard to hear you guys in the front rows back
Oh,
here.
sorry.
Yeah, because the sound's going that way.
You don't want to hear me yell.
Okay, I think, well, that was excellent. Thank you very much for corroborating what we've been hearing and we've been feeling too, that there is a lot of demand for additional housing, especially rentals, and especially moderate priced opportunities here. And, we have a really precious thing in the city because, we have the walkable community that everybody in the country is trying to achieve. And, people, millions of people are trying to, get to a situation like this. And we've got it here, in our, 1.5 square miles or whatever it's going to be, And so a lot of people would love to live here, right in the city. Okay, let's go on to question number 2. Okay, this is the hardest hitting, most important question I think we have. And that is, do you think it should be a city goal to have homes for all income levels, family sizes, and life stages?
Absolutely.
Tell me more.
Yes, but it'll be tough to implement, so I'm sure with that.
Good luck with that.
But as a goal, do you think it's an audacious goal to say this, based on the realities of the market and life and everything else, but should we say it?
Yes.
Yeah, I wonder
yes.
if you, so that, we're kind of talking utopia. So wonder if you had this plot of land and you were gonna build some affordable, moderate, wouldn't it be nice to have some senior people and some younger people that maybe are gonna coexist and help the senior people? And then you have some families, like when I sold the house next to me, we wanted a family. We really didn't want someone to just use it as a rental that would turn over. We wanted a young family. And so we didn't really have control over that, of course. But this one family came, and so they actually got the house, and they have a daughter that's like 7. And so I'm next door, and I'm the older person a little bit, but to have that mixture in this utopia, like you had your little square block there, it would be nice to have a little bit of mixing, because they could be helping each other, and that could help with the building of that, because maybe there's some Section 8, and maybe there's some subsidized, and maybe there's some rentals, but that whole group would be like a little homogeneous mixture of these people, I think.
It's tough at $400 a square foot, though.
Right, that's the other part that we haven't, that pig in the room.
Right, but I kind of feel like I think there is a point at which you kind of have to set the finance piece aside for the moment.
So wonder though, you, and this little utopia, you find this one builder who's gonna do all these, and there's an incentive for him to keep the price down. I mean, that's the only way, because you're always gonna have that thing.
But here's what it comes back to for us, and kind of for thinking about this, the zoning's R1.
Right, but that's what has to change.
Can you explain this?
So R1 is residential. It means one house, one lot with huge setbacks, and
But that's part of this whole thing.
so that's
one of the questions.
do we, I'm gonna lead the conversation a little bit here, but so kind of what this I think is trying to get at is, do you feel like we have the will in the community to make the kinds of changes that would be necessary in order to get to this goal? Because that's the next thing that we would have to do, right? Is we would have to go look at our use map in the city of Harbor Springs and say, okay, what has to change in order to make this happen?
So I had like an acre, and I was told I could only build a 1,200 square foot. But with an acre, I really could have built 1,000 square foot forward and maybe 1,000 in the back. Or the lot we had next door was 1.6 acre. And I could envision having 3 homes there that are not 4,000 square feet, of course, but they're in that 1,100, 1,000 to 1,200 square feet. And that would be the change that you're talking about, because
Let's hold off on solutions, but
No, but you know what I'm
the
saying.
macro question is, should we make it a goal to have housing that fits all life stages and family sizes and ages?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I say yes, because that's what makes a healthy, livable community where we want to live, and we aren't segregated into.
I think the operative word to me is community. I think even looking at that question, I like to think of Harbor Springs as a community. And I think we've done a lot of great things to build our community, and I know we can do a lot better. And what does that mean? It's a whole different kind of vibe when you talk about a community than you do a city. To me it is anyway. It's a lot, like you were saying, Lisa, I think that feeling of between people, you get to know people, there's a sense of ownership and a sense of value. So I say that's why I think when you mix all of those incomes and sizes and life stages, that's rich, that's a rich soil.
I hear you.
I think if we're going to survive as a viable town, we have to, or would be a resort. I mean, I think the definition of what you're saying,
Yeah.
I mean, a community is diversity, at least of some sorts, of income and family size and ages. And that Harbor, that has been disappearing in Harbor. I've been here 40 years and it is definitely disappearing. And it's not as good of a place to live as it used to be, in all honesty, for a lot of those reasons.
And our schools want, we want to have vital schools that people desire to come to. And I feel like we're on the downside. I mean, we've been here 9 years. And the schools have changed since we've been here.
They can't hear you, right?
Yeah, I'm just saying the schools, I mean, in the 9 years that I've lived here, I feel that our schools have changed a little bit with decline in class sizes and things that are offered. It's nearly impossible to find a coach to know to coach our teams because they can't live here, so.
Okay, let me role play. I'm gonna argue the other side of this. And I've heard friends and neighbors say this. Yes, Bill, I hear what you're saying, but you know what? We moved here because we like the way it is. There are places for people to live in the surrounding areas, but the city of Harbor Springs, we don't have any vacant land. We can't really make an impact. We can't do much. So that's, that kind of housing is not for us. So.
Or here's the other piece of it, it's my property.
Yep, it is.
Why should you tell me what I'm gonna build on it? I should be able to build what I want on it, and if I don't wanna build that, then I don't wanna build that.
You're not really telling them though.
No.
They
We're
do
not
tell me
telling.
what you can build.
Right, we do, we already make
do.
rules about it, and they would just be different rules, right? And people get used to the rules as they exist.
Right.
And changing them becomes scary and different.
So let me explore with you. City of Harbor Springs is little and we don't have much vacant land and, really, there's so much more opportunities in the surrounding area. And Petoskey's so much bigger. Why don't we let them handle it?
Not in my backyard.
Then
we
that
do
begs
have
the
a lot of-
question is why should someone not be able to be here? Because you think they should be somewhere else where the opportunities are already there for them. That again, it's kind of we're here, we like it the way it is, we're gonna now roll up the piece of,
We won't last
we all know that. I
So
think-
what I'm hearing is you don't buy that argument. Okay,
No.
all right, thank you for indulging me on that one.
How much vacant land is there as far as number of lots or vacant?
I think it's about 10%.
10%.
Victor, does that sound right? I think
There's a
everyone-
big piece near me.
I think-
We do have more. I know
There's more
people
than you-
say we're built out, but I don't.
Yeah, as I remember, 10% meaning vacant, actually vacant, not
Right.
ready for redevelopment. But I don't quote me on that, but in the master plan that we have now, there is a preamble that talks about approximately 90%. And that was done 5 or 6 years ago, and it hasn't, some of that's changed, but most of what's been going on in town from my observation and being in real estate for 20-some years, that is redeveloping a lot of stuff that was existing.
Yeah.
There's been a little bit of building on vacant, but not as much as redevelopment.
And we also have city land that we own, the city owns, that there's a lot of potential there. If people would think outside the box a
A
little
lot
bit.
of that city is pretty soggy.
Some of it is, some of it
But not
is.
all of it
But
is.
not
Yeah.
all of it. There are some pieces.
But right behind me is the old Perry gravel pit. Which it could house 3 houses, and I guess it came up at one point, and then there was a lot of opposition before I bought my house. They didn't want that kind of saturation in there, but it's possible. And it's a great spot.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that you think the city shouldn't ignore the problem. The city should take some reasonable actions to try to improve things. Is that correct? Okay. Well, let's talk about
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
A someone who's been covering city politics for 22 years here. I would just say, kudos to everybody who showed up for this problem. And the question too is important because it's a little bit chicken and egg, right? The people who exist here now and who have bought houses in the last 2 decades may have some NIMBY situations going on. If we're talking about the words affordable housing, it makes people very nervous about, for lack of better words, what kind of riffraff might show up here. So I would say if affordable housing comes in, then you might be bringing some family life back into this for those of you who remember growing up in a different Harbor Springs. That being said, beyond this becoming a planning commission issue that goes into a master plan that the city council has to approve, I would just recommend that anyone who believes that that should be the goal, go home and start talking to your friends and neighbors about the fact that you're going to need to show up and support the people who have to sit at the table and make those decisions. Because I can promise you that the people who oppose this stuff are going to come out. And it's really, really hard to be at the table making aspirational goals if you don't have a lot of people continuing to show up to support. So sort of a caveat.
Great point.
Well done.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's also important when you said your argument about like Petoskey should do something or something. They're struggling too. So, I mean, you can't just kick the can down the road because everyone's having trouble with it, so.
Great point.
And I
Okay,
think it's a serve yourself kind of a thing too. I mean, we are a naturally occurring retirement community, right? I mean, people have congregated here to retire, which means we need services in order to support people so that it continues to be an attractive place for people to want to come when they retire. And so if we want that to continue to be part of the economy of Harbor Springs, if all of the people who bought homes in the past 10, 15, 20 years and plan on continuing to reside here and age in place, they better figure out how to make sure the services exist to support them as they do that.
Very short-sighted.
Exactly right. So.
okay.
And not all the old people want to be surrounded by old people.
Right.
Well, there's that, and aging looks very different than it
That
did 10
brings
years
us to
ago.
the next
so.
question, Victor. So, if you like diversity of people and all that, how about young people? Should we make that a special goal, or is that
Yeah, we don't like kids.
not?
Who would
No
say
one
that?
after 1990.
Okay, so what do you mean by younger?
That's for you to perceive. It's purposely vague.
Well, let me just clarify, so that our average median age is 63 in the city.
Is it really?
Oh my gosh.
So younger than that.
So let's take that as our benchmark is younger than the median age.
Yep.
Okay.
So, let's see, here's a young person right here, Victor.
Yeah.
Victor just had to buy a place or find a place, right?
Yeah.
In the last 3 years?
Year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago.
Year and a half, okay.
I bought in Little Traverse Township.
How come?
It was hard to find something in the city that A, either met our budget or B, didn't require a lot of work or maintenance to make it into something that we wanted to do. So there are houses that are in that $200,000, $300,000 range, but you have to put another $150,000 into that to make them at least the standard that we move in ready, basically, so.
Victor, and I don't mean to interrupt, but just for everybody's reference, I think within the last 10 or 15 years, the city changed the rule where city manager, certain positions in city employment had to reside inside the city, and they were actually forced to change, or decided to change that rule somewhere around Tom Richards coming in.
So what happened was that in our charter, it states that any employee of the city has to live within city limits, but state law says we only can require people to live within 20 miles. So a lot of
that
people
was
did.
sort of a symptom of what you're talking about.
Yep.
And some of it was by choice, but a lot of it, I think it was out of necessity.
It was at the same time the prices started to really climb.
So are young people so valuable and so desirable that we ought to make it a specific, separate goal to attract them? Lisa says yes.
I think more than just a goal, maybe have an incentive.
Incentives, okay, yeah. That would follow from having an objective to do that, yeah.
How would you do that, Bill? I mean, how would you I mean, you could do deed restrictions and only people under 30 can live in your house,
Yes, you
but
could.
No, you can't.
I don't think you really can.
Tax
Well, actually, you
breaks.
can, they're voluntary deed restrictions,
Yeah.
there's a bunch of
Yeah.
different programs, but that kind of gets into
Yeah.
solutions.
But there, we know that, there are like 5 or 6 things that young people want about where
Not
they live.
age discrimination.
And it's, recreation, it's walkability, it's services, it's connectivity, and I forget what the other ones are, but
School system is one of
But,
the.
well, that, to me, the school system is already, it should be in ways, a huge attraction to younger families.
Yeah.
I can tell you from showing houses to people, from Los Angeles, Dallas, big metropolitan areas, they come here and they feel like this is a private school.
Yeah.
They love
just
it. I mean,
about
they're
is.
the school is a huge, it's to your point. I mean, my goal tonight was not talk.
Mine too.
And if you met my dad, that's probably not gonna happen. But it is an asset. You're right. People buyers who coming into the market view that very much as an asset. And some of it's as simple as kid's not a great athlete, but they were on the team, so I mean, there's some of that advantage, things like that.
I think if we do it right, we'll get young people anyway,
Yeah.
even if it's not a specific goal. I
Okay.
think from what you said, the walkability, I think all ages like that.
Mhm.
Certainly our school system is a huge
Well,
plus.
and one of the key things is affordable.
And affordable housing, yeah, I think if we do it right, we don't need to make it a separate goal. That's right.
My professional understanding of the situation, I think part of what young people and all people want, but for young people that are just especially starting out in their careers and, starting out with families, it's what is available in the city for them. And if you're talking about clothing stores, what is available where they can go and, get the clothing that they want. It's a lot of high-end clothing, they're not gonna go there. What about access to, as you mentioned, Bill, recreation, but also events and activities and nightlife and arts and culture? What is available to them that, that they want? And, why are they going maybe to other places like Traverse City or Petoskey? And not to say that we need to be like them, but what about them are attracting younger people? And maybe it doesn't need to be a separate goal, but those elements do attract younger people, and maybe focusing on those specific things. And it's not just related to housing, but it's related to what the city offers.
Right.
Environment. Okay. What I'm hearing is, yes, young people are good. Yes, we'd like them if we could get them. And, but it may not warrant being a separate goal in itself. Maybe the first one covers that when we say we would want to have people of all ages and family sizes and that kind of thing. Okay, very helpful. All right, you ready for the fun part? All right. So we're gonna run you through some approaches that other cities and municipalities are using to address their housing shortages. And we want to get your take on, is this solution a fit for Harbor Springs potentially? Okay, now we can talk about the solutions. All right, Victor, proceed. All right, first solution I'd like you to evaluate would be smaller homes, potentially on smaller lots. So this is Lisa's story. And our current, current lot sizes are between 6,500 and 10,000 square feet in the residential zoning districts. The minimum lot width is 65 feet, and then up to 100 in some. Andrew tells me there are some historic lots that are only 50 feet wide.
58, I think there's a plat, Southern and Crandall's plat, which is down 3rd, 4th Street, kind of west of Traverse Street. Those are 58 by maybe 120, something in that range. So that's about the smallest, that conforming lot. There are lots that exist that are non-conforming that are smaller, but those lots that were platted actually don't meet the zone that they're in, minimums.
So cities are, and then the lot coverage, you can only cover 35 or 40% of your lot with structure. And that, has a suburban feel, and it's a comfortable and nice feel to a lot of people, but other cities are relaxing that. The downside is that a lot of cities want to prevent Bigfoot houses that just, cover an entire, gargantuan. So there's a balancing point. Okay, next slide.
Right before you jump to that,
Yeah, Randy, go ahead.
my comment on the 35 and 40 if you were to rezone and allow for a duplex, you could then relax that standard and then avoid having the monster house go, single family house go
Right.
up. Good, have it zoned, I forget what the, for buildings.
R2 is our duplex, I think.
R2, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, then relax it only for a duplex or a quad or something like that.
And that's a good point, because I believe the R2 district right now, that is 100-foot minimum on the street. So a lot of times when we try to use R2, it's so hard to find a 100-foot lot. The south side of Main Street, for as an example, I think is almost all R2 from Zoll to
A long way down.
where the AHA is.
Yeah, the shade part, yeah.
Yeah, Shade Park, so that's, I think, R2 on the
Not
south
Shade
side, but a
Park,
lot of those
that's
lots over the years haven't been 100 feet, so you gotta do a duplex, and you can't, because it's not 100 feet.
We're gonna talk about duplexes. Let's stay on small lots and small houses, Victor. So, here are our minimum dwelling sizes. So, 864 feet is our minimum size, the smallest zoning. And then sounds like Lisa ran into the 1,200 square foot minimum when you were doing yours. And, so here are some, how do you feel about these? Do you think houses like this would be attractive and useful to?
Absolutely.
Yes.
To the right person.
When you think about it, a two-bedroom apartment is generally 800 to 900 square feet, so what's?
Or in New York, 500.
Yeah, or 200. Yeah, right. In Charlotte, North Carolina, where my son lives, they have Apple and Google moving in there, and they're just dying because they can't build fast enough. So they've rezoned a lot of areas, very high-end areas, to allow people to build little houses like this in their backyard.
In addition to the existing dwelling.
Yes, for rental.
Good, we're gonna be talking about those too.
Interesting.
So how do you feel about smaller houses than we currently allow? Is that something that you think is a fit for Harbor Springs?
With
the age is increasing and with one or two people in a house, I would think that those would be very appealing to some people.
Yeah, that was my thought.
Yeah. The studies on what people want at the two ends of the housing spectrum, which is to say people who are retired and people who are just starting, have really converged. And when you do housing studies and you ask those two groups what they want out of housing, they want almost identical things, and smaller homes is definitely one of them.
Yeah, Victor.
Bill, maybe a question also is, do we want to have different minimum dwelling sizes for different zoning districts, or should all, minimum size be for each zoning district be the same? Or change the minimum sizes of those districts? I mean, that could be a question. Because 864 is pretty small, but it's not allowed everywhere.
That's right.
I mean, true tiny homes are 400 feet less.
Yeah. Right.
So 800 is, that used to be kind of an average house size.
Well, there are all those communities in the Seattle area who've done the same thing as they've done in North Carolina. And they designed them specifically, and they're marvelous. There's commons, they're so well designed, the space, interior spaces is really well used. That, I'd be happy to be in a place like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Mine's little, but it's not that
So for the gentleman who just joined us, this is a collaborative thing. We'd be happy to have your input if the mood strikes you, so don't be shy. Okay, so I'm sensing pretty good reception to this. So what if one of these was built next to your house?
Love it.
What if two or three were built next to your house?
I think in general, there'd be a lot of pushback just because people want similar houses for comps in their neighborhood, maintain their housing value, and all of a sudden start allowing something with half the square footage, understandably, it's going to sell for less money and it's going to actually drag down the value of the bigger house. And, the old rule is you want to be the little house.
So that begs the question of, because you have a small house, does that mean you're gonna require the lot is necessarily gonna have to be that small too, so then you jam in always, that's something that we haven't talked about.
No, we haven't.
So Andrew, with your
You
other
didn't
hat on.
touch on it. You said housing density and the housing size are related. You want to get more
We
housing.
could decide to allow smaller lots.
So, wearing your other hat, your real estate hat. If something, because there's some property next to me down the road a little bit, if there were like a few houses like that, do you think that, and they were on smaller lots in this area, do you think that would necessarily bring down the price of, let's say, my house?
Depending on, it's always hard to say how it impacts value long-term, but, using Bay Street cottages, which are 800,
Right,
they're 900 square feet and 1,200 square feet for the larger one. That was done about 18 years ago, 20 years ago. The Bay Springs,
That one next to it.
yeah, Bay Springs units have sold at record levels. Marina Village units, which these are the adjacent properties, have all sold for record levels. So now those typically are more of a resort use, but it was the old motor lodge. I have the unique stat of having lived in a 600 square foot house in Harbor Springs and a 480 square foot house in Harbor Springs, which I think you lived in after me.
I lived in the 300.
300, that's what it was, 330, yeah. There's a point where small is too small, but they do exist, but they're all 100 years old and they need attention. So as far as the marketability of something like this, I would put them in the MLS on a Monday instead of a Friday, so I wouldn't spend my weekend setting up showings.
Yeah.
I mean,
And they're on 50-foot lots.
Andrew, I have another real estate question. Are comps based on price per square foot?
yes.
So yours is X
Right.
per
So
square
the square
foot, maybe
foot
these
at
are just
1,200
fewer
versus
square
800.
feet.
More, quite often the Bay Street cottages until recently have been some of the highest per square foot comps. And they get disqualified. They wouldn't be used in a report for a house that was 1,500 or 2,000 square feet. They would be used for similar houses. There's a point at which they can't account for that.
But it counts.
Yeah, but there is some.
But they're relevant.
Yeah, they're relevant. I think again, personally, I won't get too far into it because we want to listen, not talk, but there would be areas where these would make sense. It's not necessarily everywhere, but the minimums, 864, probably the more problematic would be 1,200 square feet, and I think that's an R1A. Majority of the city's R1C. So if you focused on R1C, that's a majority. I think that's a majority of the residents in the city.
So I'm hearing pretty strong support for a smaller house, nicely done, smaller houses. We have to do a lot of thinking about the lot size and how that would work and how many, structures and that kind of thing and parking. Maybe if you get too small, then there isn't room for parking on the property and we don't allow it on the street during the winter. So that's an aspect. Okay, anyway, thank you. That was
What I'm hearing though, Bill, is that it sounds like the comps won't be adversely affected by
Yeah,
having a
maybe.
small house next door. This is an odd community next.
All right, let's talk about another idea. This is accessory buildings. And so cities and areas around the country are so desperate for housing that they are encouraging people just to build something else on your property, please, and rent it out. And these are long-term rentals, they're not short-term rentals. And we have a long history of these kind of units in our community.
Right.
There's some beautiful ones. And, I think Andrew said he's lived in one. A number of people got started out living in one. Remember the show Happy Days? Fonzie lived above the Cunningham garage. Remember that? And he turned out
63, so we're gonna just barely run.
Yeah. And so it could be over a garage or it could be a freestanding unit in the property. And today, we don't allow long-term rentals of accessory buildings. And I'm told that was a very, very emotional issue, and the restrictions were put on to address the community's concern at the time, some 12 or 15 years ago maybe. And right now, you come in to the Planning Commission for a special land use approval to build this garage with guest quarters, and you have to attest, as Andrew says, that I will only let my friends and family stay in my structure, and they can only stay 21 days, and they have to leave for 30 consecutive days, and then they can come back. And I think those are the main points.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're
Ridiculous.
very strict.
What's the difference between that and apartment housing? And this is much more appealing to my mind as visually and
Yeah.
aesthetically. I grew up, I must say, in Greenwich, Connecticut, waterfront area, and there were all those wonderful old houses that all had the legitimate carriage houses that have now been, sold off, but not enlarged, not changed. I mean, they might have modified some things inside, but they're, people are dying to be able to live in those, living above a garage, and they're absolutely wonderful. And
And I
they're
also-
attractive and, anyway.
At Bald Head Island, they call them crofters, and that's what they look like. They have their, golf carts down below, and a lot of those are rented out because they want so many rentals there.
Yeah.
But that was even like building that on, as you said, an accessory building, you had to have a certain percentage above, that's in the zoning right now, of what the garage is, the percentage of the living space had to be a certain thing, because I was looking at buying a house on Arbor Street and living there, because it was in my affordability, but I had to change some dimensions of what was underneath and things like that, but I think it would be a great
It's over a
idea.
3-car garage.
We've got a lot of rules and, but communities all around the country are just really banking on this tactic as a way to increase availability right away. And again, it would be a long-term rental, so it wouldn't be a churning kind of thing. So if you live next to this garage, would it upset you if there was a family living in the main house and then a family living above it? Would you be concerned?
Yes.
I think it depends on the number of people. If there's 6 people living there, then I think that's gonna be taxing to a certain extent. But, maybe you could figure out some formula, so many people per square foot.
Sure.
And also, I think a minimum, number of months for the rental, so that you don't have the 2-week things, VRBO type of stuff.
Right.
I think that's an ideal solution for the seasonal.
Yeah, for a 4-month
Employment.
rental or 3 months.
Just to have an accessory building house.
Right, and parking might have to be
Which tends
addressed.
to be singles or couples anyway. So you don't need a lot of square footage.
Yeah.
And Bill, just the history on that 21 days, when the city, I was on planning commission when, prior to there being the original zoning, the way they dealt with accessory living quarters, they weren't allowed at all anywhere in the city. And I don't remember exactly, I hate to say it, if it was 12 years ago or 15 years ago, but it became obvious that they used to have this sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge thing where you could have a studio in the backyard, you could have everything but a bed, you couldn't spend the night in it, couldn't have a kitchen. So sort of to bring those into compliance and also afford people more opportunity, the planning commission proposed the idea of accessory living quarters, which is what these are. There was a significant amount of resistance to that, and this is some time ago. This was at least 12 years ago, 15 years ago. Sort of the reason that it became a compromise was to assure people they wouldn't be rentals. That's why the language was included, and that was the way that it was passed. Prior to that, we had no accessory living quarters. And there were several in the city that were grandfathered in, and those were non-conforming. So at least by allowing them under some limitation, those became conforming. So that's why that rule is there. And it was done quite a while ago, but at least we have it. I think there was several communities that don't allow any accessory living quarters currently at all. So.
Well, there's the issue, it's interesting, and nobody's mentioned this, and I think of it in terms of my mother, who lived on Long Island Sound, and had been a family property for years and years and years. And there are people like that that would not necessarily be able to stay there. And the town of Greenwich, which is a very wealthy town, made exceptions and said, you can take a certain amount of space in your second floor and create an apartment. That allowed her to stay in the house. She had no mortgage on the house, but it had been in the family for forever. And I think they limited she had a 2-car garage, so her renter had a car one side, she had the other. But it made it possible for someone like her to stay there and not have to sell it and turn it over to somebody who, as they've since done, tear it down and built something even bigger. So that's the sort of thing, if you could control the density of parking and I think that's one of the things that people find very offensive is somebody who has 1 million cars on their property. But that again is a zoning concern that could be dealt with, I would think.
I was gonna speak to that and say that when I was in Vermont, some of the regulations they had for accessory dwellings were, could only be, I believe, accessory dwelling 30% the square feet of the size of the main house and limited the number of bedrooms are allowed, which would theoretically limit the number of people, so you don't have that concern about. But the second thing I also wanna follow up with there is, this is all relates to not just increasing the different types of housing for people, the different units for different families, younger, older people, or with different needs. But we're also talking about increasing density, and that's something we're talking about the planning commission that we need to look at is that impact on our utility services, such as capacity for water, wastewater, electricity, and those are things that we have to take in consideration. If we do increase the density is, all right, can our system handle this increase? We obviously have the summertime population, that huge increase, as you noticed, 4,000 people maybe. But what if 3,000 people were here year round? What would that do for, how would that impact our sewer, our water, electricity? And do we have the capacity to be able to handle that? And that's something we are actively looking at from the planning commission level. So.
Yes, sir.
How would the parking be enforced and this 21 days thing? How do you enforce that? We've got
21
rules
days.
right now that aren't enforced.
Right. You're right. 21 days today's regulation is on the honor system.
Yeah, and that doesn't work.
Probably not. You know what, there's a lot of.
Which neighbors and part of enforcing laws by calling in police and everything, which creates a lot of tension between neighbors. So, I think it's a great idea to have people in, but if you got a family of 4, the teenagers get old enough, you got 4 cars, maybe 5 cars all of a sudden in a place that doesn't have that many parking spots. And you got somebody deciding to lease it out to friends on a weekly basis. How can you enforce that?
The proposal would be possibly to remove those 21-day restrictions and just make it a long-term kind of a thing. And then, parking, we'd have to figure out how to make parking reasonable. So, but it could be a way to bring, I'd say, maybe 10 to 15 housing units on the market almost immediately without building anything new, so.
And to get some people in that could work at some of the facilities and businesses and things around.
Or the hospital, or the school.
Right, the school.
Yeah. There's another aspect that Dana Mulder brought up, and that is, wouldn't it be nice if you were aging and you could rent out your place to a nice young couple who could help you out, right on the property.
Exactly.
Pick up something for you at the grocery store once in a while. So it's kind of an intergenerational potential there too. All right, let's get on to the next one. Next one is a concept called cottage courts. And these are a thing, and it's a way to build detached units around a common area. Randy actually has some experience in this area, right? You've been looking at these and designing some. And there are, so it makes kind of a community. And can you go to the next slide, Vic? So here are some other nice ones from around the country. And is there another slide as well? Yeah, so here's a possible site plan for a cottage court type thing with 6 units and there's parking on the end. And the lot that they put this on is 150 feet deep and 110 feet wide. So it's like about two of our normal lots. And so here we have 6 housing units on what used to be 2 regular city lots. Any reactions to these?
What are the implications for wintertime parking? I know they've done that in Seattle, that sort of thing. They don't provide, there are no garages. They don't need the garages. They just need a little, I don't even think the places I was reading about have covered parking.
This
So that would
one,
be, in
this
this
could
climate,
be,
it's different.
these could be carports. Or not. Long winter.
I think that's just super. I think that's a great concept. I don't know of any vacant lots you could do that on, but it seems like a great idea.
I think you'd also have to think about whether there'd be demand for it. Like I think about the cottages, and have those been quite as successful as people thought, jammed all close together?
For these, where do people put like their bikes and the lawnmower and that kind of
Yeah,
stuff?
they don't show you the sheds and the other things that they have to build.
I just wondered.
Just as an
You know, they could have
example,
basements. And,
like Bay Street cottages, we have, City Harbor has probably two of these that you'd call new. Since the zoning code was amended to allow cottage, there is a cottage overlay in the zoning code. It does require a fairly large piece of property. I can't remember exactly. I think it's more than an acre. Bay Street Cottages was the first one that took advantage of that change. They have garages. They are mostly seasonal, and then the lawn maintenance and those things are done by the association, so everybody doesn't have their own lawnmower. There's one on Lake Street, and those are bigger units, and they do have attached two-car garages with basements. So it's sort of a different, but there actually, oddly enough, have been two of these in the city in the last 20. The Bay Street Cottages was 2000. The one on Lake Street, I think, started in 2005 or 6. So.
Are those both, they're both condos, aren't they?
Usually these are configured as condominiums. Yeah, just from a regulatory standpoint, and an approval standpoint, it's easier. The mechanisms for control and upkeep and all those are in the
Would you
boilerplate.
consider these in the affordable category?
Well, it depends on, I mean, if they're
that's how
downtown, no, just because land costs. And then construction, again, affordable being relative. You have efficiencies with the land that would be, I don't know. Right now, we're in such a recency bias for things being expensive, that it does tilt, things away from being affordable right now. I think hopefully that'll calm down a little bit in the next year or two.
any other thoughts? What if one of these was next to your house?
I love it.
I'd live in it.
Yeah, I will.
Adorable.
Yeah,
Okay.
that wouldn't bother me at all.
Well, in favor of that particular site plan is that nothing happens on the perimeter. Everything is in the courtyard of the business. So if you're talking about potential population noise and density, it's gonna be isolated by the housing on the perimeter of that whole setup.
So it'd be interesting.
That's an ideal
yeah.
setup.
It'd be interesting to know how young people would think about if I was living in one of those and then they're like running one of those.
So as a
I mean,
non-young person?
Yeah, what would it be? Yeah, what would it be? How would they like that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it would be a good idea. That was my thing, that people could be helping each other in the whole neighborhood kind of. So you got
sure.
somebody with kids, two single people, you got an older person,
I would say the more difficult question with all of these housing is how do we ensure that these houses are occupied by achieving people that we want to fit in that first goal, and that is year-round people. And there's different solutions for that, but that I think is ultimately, from what I hear so far, like all these ideas are great ideas, but how do we ensure, let's say once an elderly person buys that, and then they're the only person that they're year long, and now you have, 5 people that are there for 1 month. So where's that intergenerational help and assistance?
The good thing about a lot of these, and it ties into the question of how they're usually structured, either site condominium or unit condominium, it's all condominium bylaws. Typically though, like Bay Street Cottage has a 30-day minimum for rental. It's much more enforceable probably, and from a city standpoint, favorable because the city doesn't have to spend money enforcing it. The neighbors there, when they buy in, they sign the condo docs, they understand it. There certainly have been shorter term, and I'm not just picking on Bay Street, there've been other associations that have that minimum. And they've been successful in defending it, and but it's handled internally because it is part of the condominium bylaws, and that's the Condominium Act spells it right out how that's dealt with. So it isn't like the city has to go in and enforce as they would with a single or meets and bounds description private ownership. So.
Well, I don't know how many of you are aware that the fact that Traverse City is just taken up. Now they have parking lots to spare, obviously, in Traverse City, which we don't have. But they've taken a parking lot and it's gonna be turned into year-round housing. And the stipulation on it is you cannot rent it for less than a year. And that's that's obviously part of their zoning. But again, then the
They're gonna
city has
sell
to.
I think it's lot C, that's the one
Is
you're
it-
talking
is it?
about, and I think they're gonna offer it for sale, and that's gonna be a deed restriction as part of their sale,
Yeah.
so.
Which I thought was.
And different communities handle that different ways. They handle it through deed
Yeah.
restriction programs, they handle it through housing authorities who actually own and manage the housing and so then can set their own rules about it. Condo association rules are another way to handle
And
it.
and if the city were to, I don't know, because I don't know the cottage overlay, but if it's not in there, it could be added that to approve something like this, it would have to be a minimum 6-month rental or something like that. It could be a stipulation of an approval, and then in the condominium documents.
Okay, so it sounds like you're pretty favorable towards this concept.
Yeah.
Done right, in the right place? Okay, thank you, that's great. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, let's get it right out there. Tiny homes. So these are really small.
My
But
son
it's a
is
thing
building
now.
one, so I have to be quiet.
So, do you think there's a place in Harbor Springs, or do you think tiny homes could have a place in Harbor Springs as a solution?
I definitely do, and I think that's a great situation for people who wanna come here to work in the summer. Like, again, you'd have to have some minimum length of time that they would be.
Tell them a story about Ketchum, Idaho.
Oh, Nancy forwarded me an article about Ketchum, Idaho, which is a pretty deluxe place, resort town. And they are so desperate for housing that workers have been camping in the woods, since winter. And the mayor proposed allowing camping year-round camping in the city park, in the main park, just to house people. So it would look like a homeless encampment.
Yeah.
This is a
But
better
I mean, that's serious.
Right.
In Detroit, there was I read an article a number of years ago about, actually it was a church group that were taking some of the abandoned property and making it into a community of tiny homes for like moms and one child. The stipulation that you had to have it on a permanent foundation.
Yeah.
They wouldn't allow mobile ones in there. And it was a way to get them into ownership eventually too. But that was a unique situation. I just thought it was creative thinking.
Okay.
Yeah, because I see some wheels on that one. I kind of like them and I guess not be mobile.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Yeah, I agree.
It's also waterfront, which is a little unrealistic.
Right.
That's just how we would do it.
Maybe it's just a pond.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's pretty favorable reaction to that. That's good, thank you. All right, let's talk about duplexes. So many cities are so desperate for housing that they're changing their zoning codes to allow duplexes to be built anywhere and everywhere, no special permission required, in every residential zoning district. And the thought is that it can be a super efficient way to double your housing in the same space. And it was a thing, it was a huge thing for 100 plus years in the US. Did you live in one?
Yeah, I rented it
Oh,
in
yeah.
Ohio.
Who hasn't?
And so we have very, very few today. And they, are often seen as undesirable, ugly, and so.
Isn't it the key?
What's that?
That seems to be the key,
Yeah.
to make it presentable enough or make it fit
It's
in
the
with the Harbor
architect.
Springs look that it's accepted, no matter what size it is.
You have to have a cuteness box on the
Cuteness
application.
index,
Right.
yeah.
Yes, the
All
cuteness.
right, Victor, let's look at some more duplexes. So of course, I picked out some attractive ones to show you. There are some that are not that attractive, of course. And
So how you control that.
here's some more. So I thought Mary Catherine tells us often is, don't be concerned about the number of units in a housing box. It doesn't matter. You could potentially zone for the size of the structure, and then what's inside of it is, it could be 2, it could be 3, it could be whatever you want. And that's an efficient way to do it, and don't worry about, the number of dwellings in this unit.
But so,
Okay?
question about that.
Yeah.
But that means if there's 3 families in it, that's 3 amount of bikes, 3 cars,
Yep.
3 this, that, you know. So how do you, from a zoning plan or planning, what I'm trying to say is how do you address all of that
Yeah.
kind of stuff that goes with more people living in a smaller space?
I think that's kind of what we're trying to test the waters with and getting a sense both for the people here and the people in our community. Because greater density is by definition going to mean all of those things.
Yeah.
It's gonna mean more cars, it's gonna mean more people coming in and out, it's gonna mean more bikes. In the summer, I love to walk down in Weequahic. And you know what I love about it is all the bikes dumped on the everywhere and the sailboats that are, keeled up because it looks like people live there.
Because these big homes, they have people come and there's a lot more people in there. I mean,
Yes, there are absolutely things that we would have to deal with from a planning perspective, particularly around cars, because I think cars is one of the tough ones. But simply by the definition of more people living in the neighborhood, you're gonna have more stuff. And I think that's one of the things that we hear about and will get pushback on when people think about how does that change the character of my neighborhood? How does that change my lived experience? And so is that something I am willing to think about? Is it something that's attractive to me or is it something that I think, not next to me, please, thank you. So
It's a fine line.
It is.
Isn't it? Because like some of it is fun to see, some of it is like,
right. And some days it's really fun. And when the dog next to me won't bark, won't shut up barking for 6 hours straight, I think, maybe living in the city is not such an awesome thing to do. But yeah.
But if we're walkable, maybe people don't need as many cars.
And we have a lot of parking right up there that sits empty 95% of the time. I don't know how many cars can park out there, 100 plus.
That's an interesting concept.
There's
Maybe
all
there need
sorts
to
of
be some
places.
satellite lots for overflow cars or something.
Yeah. Cars here. And if you're walkable, you don't need them.
Okay, I'm picking up that you're pretty favorable to the concept of duplexes.
definitely. I think that
With some cautions about crowding and parking and things. Okay, good. Well, if you like that, let's go to the next slide. These are fourplexes. And yep, go ahead, Victor. So here is a possible fourplex and on a lot that's only 50 feet wide. Now, that's not gonna leave much on the side yard, setback. But the depth is 120, we have lots like that.
What's the
But you need an alley in the back.
Yeah, an alley would be ideal.
Or for this neighborhood or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, my feeling is it's a little too big.
Too high. I feel like it's a lot better model than an apartment building though.
Yes.
Oh, I'm
I
not
agree.
disagreeing with, I wouldn't disagree with that, I just feel like that maybe the fourplex concept is fine, but I feel like it just goes almost to the lot line.
Sure does.
To me, it's a little too
Well,
tight.
it meets the setbacks, the 2 side setbacks per side.
Right.
And so you can build a house on Main Street that runs all the way. to
That
the
looks just
lot
like that.
Already.
Many of the big homes here, you could divide into fourplexes.
Yeah.
And they would look the same almost from the outside.
Yeah.
As they
Right.
would.
This could be a great solution for rentals.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's a huge demand for long-term rentals. All right, let's go.
I just have to say, having lived in one, I loved it. It was our own little foursome community. It was our own little mini community. And I liked the alley in the back and it was a nice feel to it.
Where was it?
That was down in Ferndale. There are quite a few of them in the Detroit area.
So what I'm hearing is you're interested, but cautious, like there's some watch outs on this one. See whether it would make sense and, would it fit? And, okay, good. Let's go to the next one. Oh, there's some more fourplexes. Let's go back. There's a nice picture. You like those?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Here's the apartment complex we were just talking about. This is a smallish apartment complex. They call it medium.
What does that mean in terms of number of units?
This might be 12 units.
It's gotta be more than that.
There's one in there.
Yeah. 12 units.
That's really cute.
Yeah. But now that's bigger footprint, yeah.
I mean, for reference, the Village of Hillside, down at the end of the street, the front building has 32 units in it, and the back building has 17.
But I can see something like that go.
Yeah, I like this much better just because it seems like, it has a driveway and a
It's a little
parking
courtyard.
lot. It seems a little more spacious. for some
Yeah.
reason.
For sure.
Would the zoning be able to limit the numbers of units because this town, we're getting to the edge of what I think people come to live in a place like this where they're trying to get away from.
That's right.
the More urban.
I mean, right now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, the number of units is determined by your lot size for something like this. So it would depend on the size
There's
of your
very little
lot.
RM district in the city, but you're right, there is a formula and it's keyed off how many units per square foot. You can configure them differently, but you can build a certain number based on your square footage of your lot. And a lot of that goes to how many cars you can fit on the property to get off-street parking.
I have a question. Is all of this considered for the city or the townships or, where are we talking?
All we can
the
talk about
different
is the
areas?
city.
Yeah.
So,
But this discussion is happening at the county level, at the other, the city of Petoskey, other city jurisdictions, other planning jurisdictions, so the townships that have their own zoning codes. This discussion is happening at all of those places.
Right,
So.
but yeah, you think, in a neighboring jurisdiction with a lot more land, maybe that would.
Yeah,
wouldn't that be nice?
it just seems that there is the ideal situation for the ideal location.
Yep.
And
Okay.
that's what you're trying to determine.
We gotta move fast. And I have another one for you. How about rooming houses and boarding houses? There's a housing concept. Sir?
No, I don't think they belong in a residential neighborhood.
Okay.
It's a short-term rental, and it's too many people coming and going, you don't know neighbors. They tried to put a rooming house half a block up from me a few years back, and everybody was against it in the neighborhood, and.
Don't we have one in Harbor now?
Yes, we do. There's two.
Down in Traverse.
There's a couple that are grandfathered in.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And oddly enough, there is a boarding house. It's permissible in R1C, but it does garner reaction.
Bill or Meg, I think you could just give a brief overview about what is meant by a rooming and boarding house.
Yeah, rooming house is a large house that would rent a room at a time. And in the traditional structure, it wouldn't have a bathroom, so they'd have a shared bathroom in the hall, and you'd be a roomer or a boarder. You'd take your meals, with your landlady or landman,
And person.
yeah, it'd be a community. And I think by definition, it often was a shorter term kind of a thing, although some people lived in them for a lifetime. So. If this was built next to your house, would you feel about that? You wouldn't be too.
Just because of the density, the number of people coming and going. I suppose if it was limited to 2 boarders or something, it would be fine,
Mm-hmm.
but,
Well, I can't say where this was, or if you're getting somebody in trouble, but we lived in a neighborhood that had one, and it was great. One of the girls dog sat for us. They were nice, they were quiet. They went to work, they came back, just like everybody else did.
how
and
many people were in the?
3.
Yeah, see, I think
3
with a
girls.
small number,
Yeah.
but there seems like there's a place that maybe overlooks the beach.
Beach view.
Yeah, that has practically people hanging out of the window.
They have a lot of fun too, I think.
Yeah, so I would
Animal
not,
house.
yeah, Animal House, right. I would not wanna be near that, so if it's a small number of people, I don't have a problem with it, because it's not really any different from VRBO. You can go rent a bedroom out of VRBO.
Unrelated people, yeah.
Yeah. And although what this made me think of was the concept of renting out a room in your house,
Right.
you know?
Is that
Yeah.
illegal, is that
Well,
illegal right
you
now?
know.
I don't know,
It starts to bump up those definitions
don't
of family that we still
think
have
it-
in ours.
So technically, it's, if you're in a single family zone, only a single family can be in a home.
all right.
And there's a definition of single family, but again, there comes the issue of who is actually, watching out. Who's occupying. We don't have time to staff to go to houses and use single family. But anyway, so does it follow our zoning code? No, but are we going house to house checking out who's renting?
It's an owner who, well, I don't live in the city, in the township, but like my house would work well for that.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it would be kind of an attractive thing.
Well, as you think about aging and aging in
just-
place
Yeah.
too, you think about live-in caregivers. I mean, if you're offering room and board for somebody to care for you, they are an employee, they are not related. Technically, they might be pushing the boundaries of what we allow, but on the other hand, we know it happens all the time.
Happens all the time.
Bill, are you thinking with these, and that's an interesting point, the difference, what Victor said is the owner living in the house, renting rooms as opposed to a house that is just purely rented by the room for 6-8 people. Is that,
Yes.
I think the
Yeah, I
ones
think that makes
the older ones we do have in the city, I'm not aware of any that there is an owner present. They've been more just,
Well,
Yeah.
did it in fact start because that's how people wanted to be able to keep their own home?
Yeah,
So they
right.
took in boarders and that was,
Right,
so it
correct.
came from a different place.
Remember, I got a job transfer and I had to get out there like the next day. And I ended up renting a room in this lady's mansion.
There you
It was
go.
unbelievable. And there were like 3 or 4 other guys that work for my company that all lived there. And, the kitchen was open. You just use that as you wanted. So it was pretty interesting. Okay, so what I'm hearing on this one is maybe there's more interest than we thought, but not just for a wide open
Right.
No,
Crazy
more like a owner.
fraternity house.
No.
With a lot of people coming and going in short term.
Just a little bit closer to the carriage.
All right. So we're a little bit over our time, but do you have any other thoughts or solutions or out of the box ideas that we ought to be thinking about?
Well, I'm just thinking that if you decide to allow the renting out of carriage houses, what's the difference of renting that out versus a room in your house? The garage is just attached instead of detached.
Good point.
Yeah.
Maybe that needs to open up at the same time.
You're right.
What about height restrictions?
Yeah. Yep, we got a lot of
I think you've
research.
come up with some really great ideas already, and I think the presentation was excellent. That's just, but I would say I'd like to see more two-family flats or townhouse style or whatever style. And typically, aren't our lots on the corners, aren't they bigger? Because in Charlotte, that's what they did. You pretty much automatically could get permission to do a two-family if it was a corner.
Okay. Ours look bigger. I
the
know.
setbacks are bigger on the corners, so therefore a lot of them,
Okay.
like you said, appear bigger or end up having to be bigger because the building envelope is smaller.
Yeah.
For an equivalent lot.
But that stuff can change. I mean, that's.
Yeah, that's the way it is, and that was more, I'm sure, sight distance safety for vehicles than it was anything.
I think one of the things we really seriously have to consider, those of us in town, is getting involved in the process of getting some public transportation, which they tried to do with MGO. I mean, that's been a very active committee. But that can solve some of the other problems if you have people that have other sorts of transportation. And you might not get the saturation of vehicles and cars and so forth in town constantly if there were some other means other than the Friendship Center bus that only deals with us old folks.
Well, funny you should mention that. There's a proposal right now to form a Emmett County Transportation Authority, which would
Right.
be different from the
They're
county
changing
and
the name, yeah.
so there has been a really skilled group who's put this proposal together and it's gonna likely be coming to us as voters to see if we'd like to do that.
Well, and I can't think of her name, the gal who started years ago. She said, I was hoping way back when that it would be established and ready for when I needed it, and we're still doing the same thing. So, but I think that's all something that maybe needs to be thought of at the same time.
I have a question for Andrew. Do you think there's any appetite among builders or developers to do this kind of stuff?
You know, they don't want to go bankrupt. So my friends I have that are in building trade, I mean, they're not opposed to it. In fact, I think a lot of them tend to enjoy building things that are a little smaller. That you get in, you build it, you know, the relationship with the owner is good when you start, it's good when you end, you know, it's sort of like a long, you know, the longer you're doing that process, sometimes it gets more complicated. So I think from the ones I've talked to, yes. And they can't build things for cash this way, so a lender has to be involved so that it has to make financial sense. But yeah, I think they do. And the one thing I was gonna just say after listening tonight and the changes that have been made, we sort of always on the planning commission have a test of, okay, a good idea or an idea that we think might be a good idea comes up. The best way, the easiest ones are the ideas that you can change something and it doesn't cause any physical change and it's reversible and it's relatively inexpensive. And that's the one, like the farmer's market moving downtown, that was brought by a group to the planning commission. We had to weigh in on it. City council made the decision. And we all sort of look at it as, okay, if we're wrong, which there's a reasonably good chance, we're all human, we're wrong, it's reversible. It's not expensive. The city didn't have to buy a lot of things to bring it downtown, and it's worked. There were some other things like that. So I think my personal feeling after listening to this tonight, and it's been reaffirmed, is that if you were going to do something in the near term that was inexpensive and reversible, it would be potentially allowing this 21-day rule that's been in existence. And it was born out of necessity to get it approved in the first place. But now 10, 15 years down the road, and we like to make changes small and slow here because if it's generally a nice place to live. We all chose to live here at some point. So, and if we made a mistake and people don't like it, it's reversible. And I think that's where you start. And it would make we've probably approved at planning commission since through 20, start of COVID to end of COVID, whatever those dates are, 8 accessory living quarters in for backyard cottages at least. So, and not everybody's interested in renting that long, and I'm talking long term, this is to improve the housing, not to increase the short-term rental. But I think that would be something that potentially would be a reasonable thing to try. And if we're wrong, it is reversible. So.
Yeah.
All right, in terms of next steps, what happens is the planning commission will kind of review your input tonight, think about it a little bit, roll around, summarize it, and then we're a few months from finalizing the master plan, but a lot of these concepts will work into it, especially the goals, and then it'll be presented to city council for their approval or modification. And then from there, we could get into the nuts and bolts if there are some changes we want to make on zoning to make some of these things possible. There'll be a lot more community discussion. Kate had a great point. There are going to be quite a number of people who might not be in favor of any change at all. And so if you feel strongly about it, then, do some advocating with your circle.
You said there was going to be another meeting to address some other.
Yeah, the short-term rental thing is so complex that we're going to have a meeting on that. And just, focus on that entirely.
Do you know when?
Nope, don't have a date yet. But this summer.
It will be kind of interesting to see, there's some pieces of state legislation that will impact that and our ability to even have an opinion about it that are coming down the pike. So, we'll kind of wait and see what's going to happen with that legislation.
And, if you want to get involved in housing, there are a couple of great groups in the area.
So I've been a part of a group called Little Traverse Bay Housing Partnership, which is kind of a grassroots organization of folks who are dealing with housing here in Emmett County. And we are a part of Housing North, which is the regional organization that's dealing with housing.
Maybe Catherine, when you say regional, how big is that region?
Well, Housing North covers 10 counties.
Okay.
So it's big, but when you think about systemic change and the kinds of things that we probably need to have happen to really impact housing on the larger scale, you really have to be thinking at that level.
And a lot of what we are trying to address is the financial question, which we really didn't delve into here today. And how do we come up with financial mechanisms that, okay, so we got the zoning figured out, we got the utilities figured out, we've got a design, now how do we actually bring it to fruition? And then the question that we didn't talk about here, which is the next step question, which is how do you keep it affordable? Let's say you build it at an affordable price, you sell it to the first person, how do you keep them from flipping it and selling it at what would be considered a market rate price? So
One thing we haven't addressed is how do you convince the powers that be and the people who are gonna push back that there is a problem and that it is a viable problem, and you know, you can't stick your head in the sand and just ignore it.
I would say the biggest two pushback questions we get when I've been out in the world taking the housing story around to different communities is one, sort of what Bill alluded to earlier, which is somebody else should deal with this. Some other jurisdiction should handle it because it's not appropriate here, so somebody else should handle it. You know, go build up in Onaway, go build in Brutus, go build in Alanson or something like that. And then the other one is kind of a related but similar question, which is why we created the whole slide around barriers, which is why doesn't the market just solve this? You're telling me that there's all this housing demand, that people are out there like banging on the door wanting housing, so how come the market just doesn't take care of it? And so why should we step in? If the market isn't gonna fix this, why should we step in and do something about it? There are really good answers to both of those questions, but that's what we get a lot. And so we have to tell that story a lot.
I can't remember when it was it was prior to the last city council election, and we could interview all the potential candidates. And the majority of them, somebody beat me to the question of affordable housing. And it was clear to me that other than the mayoral candidate, nobody thought there was a problem. And they were perfectly happy to keep it in the same, let's not change it. And the only thing he said was, you know, which told me he was thinking about it, that, you know, maybe it was time to address the zoning code. We could revisit the zoning, because that was one way to go through. So I was very pleased with that response, but I came away from that thinking, nobody really understands that this is an issue.
Well, you would hope that they would see by when they
I was
would go to a
disappointed.
restaurant and they can't get served or whatever because
Right.
there's not enough help. Or
Right.
if they see a lot
Yeah,
of help
it's
wanted, or they can't get someone
Right.
to help an elderly, they would see that we're not real viable.
Or their
We're not
kids can't move.
sustainable.
So that's it.
Yeah.
Right, and it's all up and down. I mean, that's, you know, that's one of the problems.
You mentioned, I know that there's other bills that they're being looked at in Lansing about.
For short-term?
Yeah.
For short-term
Short-term
rental.
That's just for the short-term rental piece. So is that's something that I know it was mentioned in the paper, I know you were quoted in that article too, Victor, about getting that word out, you know, to more and more people about that, you know, we can argue all we want, but if those people in Lansing say, guess what, you don't have a voice anymore, then it's a moot point, and I think it's really important to start with the end in mind there. And
So that would be advocacy, so everybody reach out to your rep, which ours in here is, you know, John Demuth.
And the governor. She'll have
And
to-
call the governor's office and-
All right, we better wrap this up.
Yes.
Cooperative and so creative and in your ideas. Thank you. You exceeded our expectations. We appreciate your input so much.
that's Harbor Springs, man, right there.
Yeah.